The worst thing for I was the thought of all those people, the forced bodily contact, the awareness of smothered breathing odors, and the crushing confinement of flesh against flesh. It was bad enough. In the lines or on the streets, the commutation was just too much. Yet, as a small boy, I could remember the day when he loved such trips. Sitting there looking out of the window as the scenery whirled past, that was always a thrill when you were a little kid. How long ago had that been? More than 20 years, wasn't it? Now there weren't any seats and no windows, which was just as well, probably, because the scenery didn't whirl past anymore either. Instead, there was a stop at every station on the line and a constant. That was people jockeyed for position to reach the exit doors inches time. No, the car was better. I reached for a container in the cabinet and poured out a couple of aspirins. That ought to help the headache. At least until he got to the office. Then he could start with a daily quota of yellow jackets. Meanwhile, getting out on the street might help him, too. A shame there wasn't a window in this apartment, but then what good would it do, really? All he could see through it would be the next apartment. He shrugged and picked up his coat. 9:30, time to go downstairs. Maybe the car would be located sooner than Bill had promised. After all, he had 9 assistants, and not everybody went to work on this first daylight shift. I walked down the hall and punched the elevator button. He looked at the indicator, watched the red band move towards the numeral of this floor, then sweep past it. Full up, he muttered. Oh, well. He reached out and touched both sides of the corridor. That was another thing he disliked, these narrow corridors. 2 people could scarcely squeeze past one another without touching. Of course it did save space to build apartments this way, and space was at a premium. But I couldn't get used to it. Now he remembered some of the old buildings that were still around when he was a little boy. The headache seemed to be getting worse instead of better. I looked at the indicator above the other elevator entrance. The red band was crawling upward, passing him to stop on 48. That was the top floor. Now it was moving down, stopping on 47, 46, 45, 44, 43, and here it was. Stand back, please, said the tape. I did his best to oblige, but there wasn't much room. A good 24 of his upstairs neighbors jammed the compartment. I thought he recognized 1 or 2 of the men, but he couldn't be sure. There were so many people, so many faces. After a while it got so they all seemed to look alike. Yes, and breathed alike, and felt alike when you were squeezed up against them, and you were always being squeezed up against them wherever you went. And you could smell them and hear them wheeze and cough, and you went falling down with them into a bottomless pit where your head began to throb and it was hard to move away from all that heat and pressure. It was hard enough just to keep from screaming. Then the door opened and I was catapulted out into the lobby. The mob behind him pushed and clawed because they were in a hurry. They were always in a hurry these days, and if you got in their way they'd trample you down like that old man had been trampled down. There was no room for one man in a crowd anymore. I blinked and shook his head. He gripped the edge of the wall and clung there in an effort to avoid being swept out of the lobby completely. His hands were sticky with perspiration. They slipped off as he slowly inched his way back through the crush of the mob. Wait for me, he called. Wait for me, I'm going down. But his voice was lost in the maelstrom of sound just as his body was lost in the maelstrom of motion. Besides, an automatic elevator cannot hear. It is merely a mechanism that goes up and down, just like the other Mechanisms that go in and out, or around and around, and you get caught up in them the way a squirrel gets caught in a squirrel cage. And you race, and the best you can hope for is to keep up with the machinery. The elevator door clanged shut before I could reach it. He waited for another car to arrive, and this time he stood aside as the crowd emerged, then darted in behind them. The car descended to the first garage level, and I stood gulping gratefully in the comparative isolation. There weren't more than 10 people accompanying him. He emerged on the ramp, gave his number to the attendant, and waved at Bill in his office. Bill seemed to recognize him, at least he nodded briefly. No sense trying to talk, not in this sullen subterranea, filled with a booming echo of exhausts, the despairing shriek of brakes. Headlights flickered in the darkness as cars whirled past, ascending and descending on the loading platforms. The signal systems winked from the walls, and tires screeched defiance to the warning bells. Old-fashioned theologians, I remember, used to argue whether there really was a hell, and if so, had it been created by God or the devil? Too bad they weren't around today to get an answer to their questions. Their underline was underline a hell, and it had been created by General Motors. I''s temples began to throb. Through blurred eyes, he saw the attendant beckoning him down the line to a platform marked underline checkout. Number 3 underline. He stood there with a cluster of others, waiting